The show is structured in such a way that it has to rely on the originals, because I don't think the show as written would be able to exist without the originals. Hey now, you're an all-star. Thanks for joining us. It's time to sit down, put in those earbuds so as not to disturb the neighbors, and join us for another episode of Off Book, a podcast where we talk all about Broadway, movies, TV shows, and anything else that we want to geek out about. I'm Mark Stoufer III.
And I'm Ashley Szuma. Today we're going to rewrite some popular movies and some plays that we think missed the mark.
No, none of this episode is trying to say that we're any better than the original authors. I've written several screenplays, wrote a lot for theater, and we've both watched a lot of films and musicals, but we are not industry professionals by any means. That said, sometimes it's cool to get an outside perspective from some people who haven't been involved in the project. Although, if you want to hire us, my email is in the description. The first piece we're going to try to tackle today is Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, which, for those of you that don't know, is a Broadway play that is kind of trying to continue the story of the Harry Potter movies. And pretty much everybody agrees that it's just a blatant cash grab move. And some people like it, and I've heard that it is better if you see it than if you read the script. Neither of us have seen it, but we both read the script and think that it could be better. I think that fundamentally, the issue is it's called Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, but Harry Potter is a significantly smaller character than you'd expect him to be. He basically exists just long enough to be able to put his name on the piece. And I get that they want to shift the focus from him and his friends to his kids. It makes sense. But I think at least give him some sort of subplot to give him a reason for being there. I think if you're going to call it Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, you need to have Harry Potter and also the Cursed Child, not just one of them.
Yeah, and that was like the big problem that I had with it, because obviously I grew up reading Harry Potter, watching Harry Potter, and when I found out that she came up with this like screenplay, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited, because that means we're going to see more of Harry Potter. But we don't.
Yeah.
At all.
Not to mention that, spoiler alert, by the way, if you haven't read the script or seen the show, and you want to, make sure you do that before you listen to this episode. But the general plot is that Harry's son goes to Hogwarts and meets Draco Malfoy's son. They become friends, even though they're not supposed to, because Harry and Draco were rivals, and eventually learn that Cedric Diggory's grandfather is mad at Harry because of something that happened during the Triwizard Tournament several years ago. So they, along with this other girl they meet, use the Time Turner, which apparently still exists even though the rest of them were destroyed, to go back in time to try to stop what happened at the Triwizard Tournament. But every time they try and travel back in time, they get less time, and then eventually the girl turns out to be a witch that has nothing to do with anything, and they have to fight her, and Harry's there occasionally to be a dad. And Ron is there very, very little to be, I guess, in the show. He doesn't even really do anything. And Hermione is the Minister of Magic, and she basically exists to also be there. So of the trio, Harry's the only one with significant stage time, but even he is really only there just to say,
he's in the show, and he's a dad now.
And I think that that's something that really needs to change if they're going to call it Harry Potter.
Yeah, it definitely didn't feel like a Harry Potter film screenplay thing to me. It felt like Back to the Future. And
right.
The other thing is, the problem like with the Time Turner, as most Potterheads know, you cannot be seen or it will mess everything up. And they're just going on and on about all of this weird thing. They're trying to like fix this part of the Triwizard Tournament. None of it makes sense. And you're just like, what the heck? Like, more spoiler alerts. So the girl they meet is like claiming to be related to the Diggorys. Spoiler alert, she's not. She's actually the daughter of Voldemort and Bellatrix Lestrange. So they're like going back in time with this like girl, and then she ends up being evil, and it's like weird. But how I think it should have gone, for me personally, is get rid of the Time Turner stuff. No one cares about that. Who cares if Cedric Diggory's grandfather is mad at Albus for literally doing nothing? I think what should have happened is, I think this girl, I totally forgot her name, but she should have risen to power and basically did exactly what Voldemort did. You know, tried to kill everyone at Hogwarts. especially Albus. And that would have been way more entertaining and way more of a Harry Potter type feel than this whole time travel thing.
Yeah, exactly. And now it's sponsor time.
The following pretend advertisement is a joke and should not be taken seriously.
Do you have an extremely popular film franchise that you want to get a little bit more money out of? If you do, congrats, you're part of a very small group. But also, you're probably going to need some new people to help you, so that way it doesn't seem like as much of a blatant cash grab. And luckily, our partners at Movies Overwhelmingly Net Earnings for You can help. They have a huge team of very good professionals for you to choose from that can make not very good films, video productions, or TV shows for your movie franchise. And for a small extra fee, you can use 2 professionals and they get to fight about the future of your franchise, while they're in the middle of making it. Making a boatload of money while disappointing your fans has never been so easy. Back to the rewrites. A YouTuber named Austin McConnell did a series of YouTube videos that go way more into depth about this plot. I'll link them down below, but something that he said in his video was that this play seemed an awful lot like a time travel story that was trying to be a Harry Potter story, whereas most Harry Potter stories were a kind of a murder mystery type story concealed with a fantasy magical story. So I think that you have the ability to kind of create these 2 different stories, where on the one hand, Elphine Diggory is trying to become the next Voldemort and follow in her father's footsteps, and trying to bring him back, and so you get this kind of whispers that he might be coming back, and that there's somebody who's trying to continue his reign of terror. And on the other hand, you have a lot of the original characters like Harry and Hermione and Draco, who all work at the Ministry of Magic, and who are going to be in charge of trying to figure out what's going on with these whispers about Voldemort. And you have Delphine doing these things, and then it's the Ministry's job to try to fix them. And then you end up with this kind of conflict of interest, where Harry is trying to work for the Ministry and stop the rise of
Voldemort 2.0.
Meanwhile, Harry's son makes friends with
Voldemort 2.0.
And so therefore you end up with this kind of fights that are very similar to what happens in the original, where Harry's trying to be a good dad but also can't, and is trying to kind of shed his legendary name and is just trying to make the world a better place. But his son doesn't realize that because he's been duped. And so I think there you have a lot of the same push-pull, but you also have some action for both the new and original characters, and I think it seems a lot less time travel-y and a lot more Harry Potter-ish.
Yeah, and I feel like another thing that like J.K. Rowling was kind of worried about is that it would just kind of be basically kind of like a rewrite, you know, like, oh, Voldemort's rising again, so they have to fight it, and there's another Potter and another Malfoy. So like she was probably worried that it would just sound like the same story again. But if you think about it, that's the story we all fell in love with. That's what we love. And it's hard to take this story that we're so used to and try to transform it into something completely different that has nothing to do with like Harry Potter. And I mean, if you think about it, the Time Turner was really only in the original Harry Potter films only a handful of times.
To go take more classes, I would add.
Yes.
That's the only, it was to save a hippogriff and to let Hermione take more classes. It was not a major plot device.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know why she would write an entire screenplay based off this thing, for one, that should have been destroyed, and 2, that had very little significance in the original films or books. It didn't quite make sense to me at all.
I think that the allure of time travel is that you can do things you wouldn't be able to normally. You'd be able to add this new sense of tension. But I think that in adding time travel, unless you do it right, which in my opinion they didn't, I think you just end up with this almost lack of tension, where you know that no matter what happens, they can always come back and undo it. And sure, they have less time to do it every single time, but it really just makes it feel like, okay, how long is this going to go until they run out of time and have to actually start doing things? And so I think if you eliminate time travel and you make it more about the same kind of the mystery and whodunit, trying to figure out what's going on, and then also including the Hogwarts adventures, you really kind of just split their original Harry Potter formula in half, where you have the Hogwarts adventures trying to fit in at school, and you have the whodunit mystery that Harry always went on with his friends, and he's still doing the same thing. He's just getting paid for it now, and his son is just trying to live a normal life, but is getting sucked in by his father's reputation and what his father's doing. And I think that is a much more compelling way to turn those tropes and what people are expecting on their heads by changing the formula slightly, but you're not completely changing everything about it and creating a story that just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and another problem that I have with the Time Turner is I just finished reading the book because I'm rereading the series again, and for the third time.
Nice.
But I just finished reading Prisoner of Azkaban, and the thing is, when they used the time turner, like, all the timelines matched up. So when Harry and Sirius were getting attacked by Dementors, and Harry thinks he sees his dad, it's, spoiler alert, it's really just him. It was all supposed to match up. But when Albus and Scorpius get this time turner, and they're like, oh, let's go change everything, and there's no recollection of Harry seeing any sort of resemblance of Albus, because obviously J.K. Rowling didn't know she was going to write this stuff. There was nothing, like, in there about them. So, like, I feel like the timelines just don't match up, and this is when everything turns bad and they're messing with time.
Yeah, time travel is such a hard thing to do on stage because you don't have the aid of any visual effects. If you look at a story like Back to the Future, the musical, over in the West End, they have a stage adaptation of Back to the Future, but they don't have Back to the Future Part 2, which is where Marty is constantly interacting with himself, because that just isn't possible unless you, I don't know, I guess you could use some body doubles and lighting, but it's so hard to actually pull off time travel where you're interacting with yourself, and that's what has already been established as time travel in the Harry Potter universe. So saying that
we're undoing and redoing
isn't just confusing, it also just changes the rules because that's all they could do. But if you can't do it the way you originally did it, how about you just don't?
Yeah. Another thing is that made me, for a person who's just, like, started reading Harry Potter, or, like, hasn't read Harry Potter but they wanted to give Cursed Child a try just to see if they liked it, then they're going to be kind of lost because you're like, what is this supposed to look like?
Right. Yeah, it definitely relies very heavily on you knowing who the characters are before going to see this show. But I think I think that part of that is just because that was what it was intended to be. It was billed as the 8th book in the series. And so I think that you can make the case that that explains why there shouldn't be a play at all. But I think if people are going to see that, I think that it works. I think that that's not supposed to be an entry point into the series. There is a chronology you're supposed to follow. But I do think that the movies are not entirely, but kind of, as well as the original books, are kind of standalone adventures. They do talk about the other ones, and it is helpful to read them in order, but if you were to just pick up a Harry Potter book, you could kind of figure out what's going on, whereas there's so much about the original play that even though it doesn't include any of the original characters in a large capacity, it consistently references them over and over again. It's like you could replace half the play with just flashback to this movie scene, and it could probably do the same thing, which is why I think it would be so helpful to try to move away from that and to start saying that these original characters are doing their own thing now, and they have a subplot, as well as these new characters, which also have a subplot, and they can intertwine, but it's not based on what happened originally. It is a standalone adventure that builds on the universe and the character development, but it doesn't rely on it for its substance.
Yeah, like you were saying, it goes back to the other, like, books, films, whatever, like back to the Triwizard Tournament, which is Goblet of Fire. And people who have never seen Goblet of Fire, read Goblet of Fire, they're gonna be like, what is this Triwizard Tournament? What is this thing? Like, what happened that made Cedric's grandfather so mad, you know? But it could have been very good. And I also think that J.K. Rowling was kind of afraid that if she didn't have the characters living in the past, if that makes sense, you know, like going back in time to this moment, that she thought it wouldn't do as well as the Harry Potter books, because, you know, that's like the stories that we love and that we know, and this is a whole new thing. We weren't, I wouldn't say ready for it, but we weren't like really expecting it a lot. And like, you could tell that there was going to be some kind of sequel because of the ending of Deathly Hallows, but this isn't the approach that we thought she was going to take. Like, I thought it was just going to be about Albus, Scorpius, and their adventures at Hogwarts and trying to like end the bad guy. I don't know. Like a Harry Potter film, but it felt very Back to the Future for me.
Right. Yeah, I think that ultimately the plot of the film, relying so much on the original series, is really just a pretty good metaphor, I think, for why the show exists at all. I think that the show is structured in such a way that it has to rely on the originals, because I don't think the show as written would be able to exist without the originals, because it isn't a standalone adventure. So I think if you make it primarily about the new characters and give them their Harry Potter-esque Hogwarts story, but instead of them facing off against a new villain every year, they're just trying to be normal kids. Meanwhile, Harry is still trying to be Harry and avoid the danger that inexplicably finds him every year. I think that you end up with something that seems more familiar, but can reverse the tropes and doesn't rely so heavily on what originally happened, which opens it up for people that haven't necessarily seen everything, but also makes it just a much more cohesive story that isn't trying to constantly explain away why this doesn't work and this doesn't work and why this is happening.
Yeah, I completely agree. I feel like it should have taken a different route than it really went. And it was sad because I really enjoy Harry Potter. Harry Potter is one, if not my favorite franchise, but it just gives off a different feeling than the rest of the books do. And I don't see myself really going and reading it a lot. This is my third time reading Harry Potter, and I don't know how many times I'm gonna reread The Cursed Child, because it's it just feels different and it feels weird.
And now we've reached the end of today's program. Make sure to join us next week for part 2 of this episode, when we start to try to do some rewrites to the sequel trilogy from Star Wars. Until then, have a great week. We'll see you then.